The Zong Massacre was the mass killing of over 130 enslaved Africans who were thrown overboard from the British slave ship Zong over several days from November 29, 1781, as a means to claim insurance. The ship was running low in drinking water, and the crew had made multiple navigational errors. So to cover up their mistakes, they made the most horrible decision. In August 1781, Zong set sail from Ghana for Jamaica with 442 enslaved Africans aboard. Zong was owned by a Liverpool-based syndicate of slave traders led by William Gregson. Some of the slave traders included his sons, John and James, and his son-in-law, George Case. William Gregson became the sole owner or part owner of a number of slave ships, including the Zong, which he bought at the height of his slave trading empire. Surprisingly, William Gregson was born into a working-class family, with his father being a porter, although his mother is unknown. During his youth, he worked as a rope maker, which was vital to Liverpool's shipping industry. At the age of 23, he and 4 other partners invested and built an 80-ton ship called the Carolina, one of 30 slave ships trading out of Liverpool at the time. However, the ship was not successful, as 48 out of 332 slaves were lost on a route from the Bight of Biafra to Kingston, Jamaica, and the Carolina was lost at sea. However, 2 years later, he and 3 other partners invested in another slave ship called the Blackburn, but the ship was hijacked by the French. Despite this, Gregson kept on investing in more ships, eventually becoming very successful. He was elected mayor of Liverpool in 1762 and stayed for a year, extending the city's canals and modernizing its docks. Gregson went on a hiatus from the slave trade in 1777 due to the British being at war with the American colonies. Between 1776 to 1783, Britain saw a 60% decrease in slaving activity. He re-entered the slave trade in 1780, taking co-ownership of the William with his sons John and James, his son-in-law George Case, and 2 others, James Aspinall and Edward Wilson. The ship went on 5 successful voyages before being shipwrecked in 1787. He purchased the Zong in 1781. The Zong was a Dutch vessel and was originally called the Zorg. It was seized in 1781 off West Africa by the British, along with 244 Africans on board, and then bought by Gregson and his syndicate. With a new crew, captained by Luke Collingwood and an experienced slave ship surgeon, the Zong traded at the Cape Coast and Accra, now with 442 enslaved Africans aboard. The ship was insured with underwriters in England at 8 grand, sailed for supplies in São Tomé, leaving there for Jamaica on September 6, 1781. There were a lot of problems with this voyage. First off, Captain Collingwood was ill throughout much of the voyage. On November 18th or 19th, the ship saw Tobago and sailed on, instead of stopping by to refill its water supplies. On November 27th or 28th, they sighted Jamaica from a distance of 27 miles, but had mistaken it for the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, and sailed on. The crew only realized their mistake after the ship was 300 miles leeward from the island. The navigational errors may have been made due to a lack of rigid command structure. As the captain was ill much of the journey, the first mate or second in command in the vessel would have replaced him, except his second in command, James Kelsall, was actually suspended from duty following an argument with Collingwood on November 14th. The vessel's only passenger, Robert Stubbs, took the position of captaining the ship. He was a former captain of slave ships. The ship eventually ran low in drinking water. Between November 29th and December 1st, 1781, 132 Africans were thrown to their deaths from the Zong. When the ship arrived in Black River, Jamaica, on December 22nd, Captain Collingwood died shortly afterwards, and the surviving African captives were advertised for sale. The ship's logbook, which records everything that happens on the ship, disappeared mysteriously. When news of the massacre arrived in England, the ship owners made a claim for compensation, but the insurers refused to pay, even though they took out insurance for their quote-unquote cargo of enslaved people, since this was the standard. The ship owners took the insurers to court in 1783. In March 6, 1783, the insurance case went on trial, Gregson v. Gilbert, at London's Guildhall. The judge present was Lord Chief Justice, the Earl of Mansfield, who previously ruled in 1772 that slavery was never supported by the common law in England. In this trial, the insurers claimed that the ship's logbook was deliberately destroyed, but this was denied by the Gregson syndicate. The only witness that gave evidence was Robert Stubbs, although Kelsall wrote a note to the lawyers. The jury found in favour of Gregson because of a maritime protocol that considered enslaved Africans as cargo. After all, enslaved Africans were considered property and not as human beings. Concluding the case, Lord Mansfield said that the jury had no doubt that it shocks one very much that the case of slaves was not the same as if horses had been thrown overboard. The question was whether there was not an absolute necessity for throwing them overboard to save the rest. The jury were of opinion there was. On March 19th, abolitionist and former slave Oluwada Equiano raised awareness about the Zong Massacre in the abolitionist movement. He told English abolitionist Granville Sharp of the details. Granville Sharp's involvement in the abolitionist movement began in 1767 when he defended a severely injured slave in Barbados against his master. Since then, he was involved in arguing against the very concept of slavery, including publishing the first tract in England against any justification of slavery. He was also instrumental in Lord Mansfield's ruling that declared no legal basis for slavery. A newspaper also detailed the event in the Zong slave ship, reporting that the captain threw slaves overboard in 3 batches. The next day, Sharp sought legal advice about potentially prosecuting the crew for murder. There was an appeal made by the insurers. A hearing took place on May 21st to 22nd, where Robert Stubbs was also present. Sharp attended the hearing together with a secretary he hired, and the secretary took a written record of the proceedings. Stubbs claimed there was an absolute necessity for throwing over the Negroes because the crew feared that all the slaves would die if some were not thrown, whilst the insurers argued Collingwood made a blunder and mistake. Stubbs claimed there was an absolute necessity for throwing over the Negroes because the crew feared that all the slaves would die if some were not thrown, whilst the insurers argued Collingwood made a blunder and mistake in sailing beyond Jamaica, and the slaves had been killed to claim compensation. They believed that Collingwood did this as he did not want his first voyage as slave ship captain unprofitable. The insurers said that the killing of slaves was murder and should never be justified. New evidence sprung up. During the second day of the killings, there was heavy rainfall. However, there was a third batch of killings on the third day. This led Lord Mansfield to order another trial where he believed that this should be a murder case. Running low on drinking water could not be used as an excuse because of that rainfall. Mansfield concluded that the insurers were not liable from the losses of the Zong ship, but there is no evidence that a murder trial ever took place. The news of the Zong Massacre gained national and international attention. Despite no member of the crew ever being prosecuted, it served a profound effect on the abolitionist movement, and the event may have led to the founding of the Abolitionist Society in 1787. In addition, the first regulation of the slave trade was passed in 1788. Historian James Wolvin said, "The Zong case lit the blue torch paper in England. It aroused abolitionist anger and fed into the initial campaigns against the Atlantic slave trade." In 1807, the slave trade was abolished. However, this caused a surge in Africans being thrown overboard because crews would rather throw them off than to be caught with slaves on board and have the vessels impounded by the Royal Navy, who were tasked with chasing suspected illegal slave ships. In 1833, slavery was abolished in the British Empire. There is a plaque that commemorates the Zong Massacre in Black River, Jamaica, where the Zong finally arrived and pays tribute to the 132 enslaved African ancestors who drowned in the massacre. The plaque was installed in 2007. The Zong Massacre served as a catalyst to the growing abolitionist movement. It happened during the height of the slave trade, but Gregson's career was not ruined. By the 1780s, he was in his 60s, and his business was overtaken by his sons in the 1790s. His last direct involvement in the business was with 3 ships, the Ariel, the George and the Will, in 1793. By 1800, when he died, he was Liverpool's leading citizens and also had his business extended into the insurance and banking industries. Over the course of his half-a-century-long career, he had a stake in 152 known slave ship voyages, which carried 58,201 Africans, of which 49,053 survived to the Americas. The Zong Massacre is truly one of the worst events to have taken place during the British slave trade and should never be forgotten. Thank you for watching this, and I hope you learned something new.